All right, so we're going to get started here in just a couple seconds. So we would like to hold all the questions to the end. If anyone has any questions, you can use the chat box or the messaging center down below, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. We also want to be respectful of everyone's time. So we will see how many questions come in. But I'm really excited to share with you incorporating native plants into your landscape. I'm Peter Gordon. I'm with Chalet Nursery. I used to be the city forester for the city of Lake Forest. Also ran their forestry and parks department, and also was the director at Lake Forest Openlands before coming to Chalet. So I'm really excited to be here. I'm excited to share this presentation. Our design group, Eric Braun and Carly, in our marketing group, really helped to put together this presentation. And so I'll be sharing it with you over the course of the next 40 minutes or so. And again, if you have any questions, certainly feel free to ask. So we're going to dive into incorporating native perennials into your landscape. And so I think
Hi, everybody. Sorry about that. You're back on. Okay, let's just share the screen. Okay, there we go.
All right. Hopefully we have fixed these technical difficulties. So just bear with me really quick. So I think we left on the echinacea and quickly we're moving in to cultivars of natives. And so you may notice when you come to the garden center that there are a bunch of echinacea to pick from. As a matter of fact, last time I counted through some of our vendors, there was 38 different echinaceas to pick from. And most of those are cultivars. So those are not true natives in the term that we're used to hearing, plants that have been around for 100 and even 1,000 of years. So a nativar, which is a common phrase, is really a cultivar of a native plant. And most of them have not even been grown in our native environment. So what we see in Lake Forest and what we see in Kenilworth and what we see in Wilmette and Winnetka is slightly different. So these plants really have not had a chance to acclimate. A lot of them are coming out of the botanic gardens and other types of garden centers throughout the Midwest. And so every situation is a little bit different. And we also see that some of these plants don't remain on the market that long. And so if you recall the last picture that I showed you of this echinacea with the really purple pink flower, this is actually a double. It's called Pink Double Delight. And so, you know, aesthetically, it's a great plant. But, you know, as far as wildlife goes, pollination goes, and diversity goes, you know, that's to be questioned. And so nativars really are different than native plants in their flower color and their scent, their shape of the number of flowers and petals, their phenology, their foliage color, and more. And a lot of times we pick these nativars or these cultivars because of an attribute that we find very attractive. It could be their leaf color in the fall, it could be their flower color in the spring. It might be a flower color that's completely different than the species. And so those are kind of the attractants that end up bringing a lot of these plants to market, and that's what usually attracts the consumer. And so really what I'm here today to talk to you about is, you know, if you are looking for a coneflower, if you are looking for a Baptisia, there are a lot of natives that really are tried and true, can offer the same types and similar colors as the nativars, but actually offer a lot more to our pollinators. And so we know that native bees, butterflies, and other pollinators have a preference to native wildflowers and trees. But the question is, how much of that do we really know? And we're really trying to answer that question through a program that was started by the Chicago Botanic Gardens called the BUDBURST program. And they really are focusing on a couple things. One are plant pollinator relationships changing as the climate changes. And the other thing is, do native insects prefer native plants versus nativars? And that's a great question. Who's going to answer that? Well, citizen scientists like myself and others have been asked to evaluate these plants. And so 3 years ago, I entered the BUDBURST program at my own home, where I was given a number of different perennials. And an example would be I had a number of Rudbeckia, or Black-Eyed Susan. I had a number of penstemon that I was evaluating, a number of different asters. And my job is to evaluate these plants every other day, sit in the garden for about 10 minutes, document the weather patterns. Is it cloudy? Is it sunny? What are the temperature? What are the winds? And then see who's landing on each one of these plants. Usually the 5 different plants that we had in a certain species were about blooming at the same time. And I got to tell you, the first year I rocked it. I was out there 30 or 40 times. But then last year COVID hit. And the last thing I wanted to do was sit in a bucket by myself in my garden last year, when I had already gone ahead and socially distanced from most of my friends and family and neighbors. This year, you know, I'm right back at it. And now that I'm able to socialize with my friends, family, and neighbors, I'm just wondering if I want to find myself sitting on a bucket by myself in the middle of the prairie. So I haven't crossed that bridge, but It's because of people like myself and other people who are citizen scientists along with other botanic gardens who are asking the question and getting the answers to the fact, do native pollinators prefer native plants over nativars? And so, you know, a lot of us, when we think about natives, we think of prairies, open fields, right? We have this idea of these vast lands. You know, some of us think about more grasslands when we think of prairies. Others might think of the fact that we have buffalo, you know, and that landscape's really not meant for their yards, when in fact, Chalet does a lot of different designs throughout the North Shore, to include Art Deco, cottage gardens, English gardens, English formal gardens, farmhouse contemporary. And as I go through these, you'll notice that each one of these houses has perennials in it, whether it's a formal planting or it's a traditional planting. There are a number of perennials that are involved in every single landscape. And so as landscape designers, we can also go ahead and incorporate native plants into these designs. And so do we need to pick the trendy coneflower? Do we need to pick the trendy Baptisia? You know, we ourselves need to ask the questions, can we plant for our clients more native plants that really are enduring, that will last a much longer time than some of the trendy natives or trendy nativars that are coming out? Here we have a country garden. You can see all the color here with the annuals. And quite honestly, a lot of those can be duplicated with the natives that we have. Here we have coneflower, we've got some allium in there, just a really great little prairie garden where you would expect to see a lot of these natives. But in every one of the other gardens that I've shared with you, native and non-native, perennials are a major part that contribute to the aesthetics of the garden. So with that, we're going to get started. We're going to dive into a lot of these plants. And what I want you guys to kind of take away here is that when we look at a plant like this allium, allium is the genus, and that's what we're focusing on. The species is a little bit different. So let me give you an example of that. If you have an oak tree, you have this genus Quercus. If you have a white oak, you have Quercus alba. And if you have a red oak, you have Quercus rubra. They're both oaks, but yet the species is different. And so even though we're going to be talking about a lot of native perennials, the genus will be the same, whether they're non-native or native, and then the species might be slightly different. In this case, this is nodding wild onion. A lot of you know this plant is allium. A lot of you know onion or alliums, chives in the onion family. They actually have an onion scent to it. This is a great plant. It has a great winter characteristic. It's great for cut flowers. It does smell a little onion-like when you bring it in. And it's not as bright pink as the alliums that are out there now, like Millennium. Millennium is actually a plant that has been used recently here and up and down in the North Shore, kind of a trendy plant. And it's actually been said that this plant doesn't reseed. Well, I actually have Millennium in my garden, and here it is to the right. And you can see over to the left, right at the base by that manhole cover, is a allium that's reseeded. So here we have a relatively new plant. It's in the allium family. It's been bred so that it doesn't reseed. It's also gone ahead and has a better flower that lasts a little bit longer, that's more upright instead of nodding. But in my own garden, I'm starting to see it reseed. And so that's kind of sets a tone for a lot of the plants that we see coming out as new cultivars. Is in trials, they don't perform the same way that they perform in someone's yard. And so in my case, I did like the way that this allium looked, but as you can see, it's starting to recede. And so I need to be concerned, is this going to be a bully native, or is this going to be a little bit more invasive in my garden? Lead plant is a plant that not a lot of people are aware of, not a lot of people use. I think it has kind of a Coreopsis look to it, which is a shrub. It's got these great blue flowers, silvery foliage. If you really look at the leaves closely, they're soft, light, and lacy. And on the bottom right, we've got this kind of winter head, which is great for birds to go ahead and feed off of. And the nice thing about the sheets that I'm sharing with you today is that they show different seasons. They also show flowers, both in season and sometimes out of season. We get a lot of clients who say, well, what does that look like in the summer? What does that look like in the spring? Here's a good example of what this looks like in the winter. And I'm a big advocate of leaving my perennials up in the winter. I think it makes great winter interest, but I also think a lot of what we plant provides food for our native wildlife. So this is one that certainly has been underused, a great plant for full sun, and gets about 18 to 24 inches wide and about 36 inches tall. Another one is an anemone. When we see these in the garden center, a lot of them are pink. The native anemone is more white. And what I like about this one is that a lot of people are looking for a ground cover. And most people would not think of an anemone as a ground cover. A lot of times you would think about sweet woodruff as a native that goes ahead and loses its leaves in the wintertime. An anemone also dies back, but I think once the flowers are gone, it makes a great ground cover. Again, in my garden, this is an anemone. You can see how robust it is. It's easily transplantable. I have this both in part sun and in full sun. It's in full bloom right now. And so it's a great plant to go ahead and add to your garden. Again, the cultivars are pinks and they're whites they're pinks, dark pink, light pink. And so, we have to ask ourselves, are pollinators coming to this plant because they're coming there because they're white in the smell of the flowers? Or is it the color that's really driving them? And again, the BUDBURST program is going to help us understand that better. Columbine, most people know Columbine. It is just one of the most beautiful, intricate flowers. I put that right up there next to Dicenter or Bleeding Heart, two of the most unbelievable flowers that Mother Nature can provide. When you really look at the detail of either one of those flowers, it's just amazing. I consider this plant a great native, short-lived, and you a lot of times don't realize it's short-lived because it hops around. It's such a prolific seeder that one time you think it's to the left of your sidewalk and the next time you find it to the right of your sidewalk. That's because the seeds get dispersed quite frequently. The ones that are on the market that are non-native are really in the blue category, sometimes the violet category. You can see this particular one is red and yellow. That's usually a sign of the natives. And they've actually gone down to create some nativars that are much smaller in stature. So this one gets about 36 inches high. Keep in mind when we talk about height of perennials, that has a lot to do with the flower head. So as the flower head disappears you go ahead and deadhead it, the plant itself might be considerably smaller. So when you hear 36, I don't want you to think that's the overall size of the plant. Typically, that's where the flower sits above the plant. Ginger is another great ground cover for the summer months. It's not going to keep you covered over the winter like Pachysandra. This actually has a really tiny red flower that most people don't even notice, but when you're in the area, you smell this small, faint sweetness in the air, and that's usually ginger. On the bottom right-hand corner, you can kind of see that ginger. Now, I did not pull this slide out enough to kind of study it, but in the bottom left-hand corner, it looks like that ginger might actually be a European ginger. It has more of a glossy color, whereas the native ginger up top is a little bit more flat in its color. I have had marginal success with this plant. I'm starting to go ahead and figure out my yard a little bit better, and where I have placed it recently, it's starting to take off. Makes a great ground cover. I am a designer who believes in designing in layers, and this is certainly a great layer to add to anyone's garden, and it spreads really nice. And it's great for full shade. A lot of people who come into the store ask about full shade plants. We're so lucky to have the tree canopy that we do, and this is one that certainly should not be overlooked. Butterfly weed. There was just something on the news today about the city of Chicago giving away monarch seeds. So basically what they were talking about is milkweed seeds. There's a big push to try to get the monarch population back up. Asclepias falls into the milkweed category, although this one's a little bit different. This is a really tricky plant to grow, but once you end up growing it, it brings an orange into the garden like no other. There's not many orange perennials out there. This certainly is one that's great. It likes it hot, it likes it dry, and once you get it established, it is kind of a showstopper. When you can have an orange flower like this in your garden, you can see it backdropped in the bottom right-hand corner with the white. It really goes ahead and, it's just a great plant. The thing to know about Asclepias is that, as we know, monarch butterflies like those, but that's really the caterpillar. When you think about pollinators and you think about monarchs, we need to make sure that we are providing a food source all the way through fall. So even though we have this Asclepias, whether it be swamp milkweed, common milkweed, or butterfly weed, those are food sources in the spring. We have to make sure that our gardens are pollinating plants throughout the whole year so that these monarchs can get that food source. Baptisia is a great plant. Interesting enough, Chicagoland Grows through the Chicago Botanic Gardens has introduced 2 or 3 Baptisia that have a slightly different flower than the native, which is this blue. And so they're participating in the BUDBURST program so we can all learn about nativars versus natives, and yet they're still releasing some Baptisia. And the ones that they're releasing are quite beautiful. They have yellow blue flowers. The native plant has a very pea-like appearance in its foliage. Its flower is tall. What I like about this particular plant is that it stands erect throughout winter. It gets a black stem and a black pod. This happens to be at a park in Lake Forest, and it actually makes a great shrub border. So if you are looking for a shrub border that's perennial, I highly recommend Baptisia. It does prefer to be kind of in a hot, dry climate. Has a very extensive root system. It's hard to transplant when it gets to this size. And so it's not one you're going to divide quite frequently. So if you do like it, it probably needs to stay there for a long time. But just a great plant. Literally, this wall will be about 3 feet of perennial Baptisia. Bellflower, a lot of people are familiar with Bellflower. There's a number of different ones. This happens again to be the native, which is a little bit taller. You know, I would recommend this one in a taller perennial garden. I think it certainly can rival some of the larkspur and the delphinium that are out there. Also a good woodland plant. Blue's really not a common color that we see so much in the perennial garden. And this is one that I think adds definitely some great flowers on this tall spike. It's a little bit lighter blue in color than some of the other blue clips, which are smaller campanulas. And this is a great naturalizing plant that I think really is somewhat underused. Turtlehead, a lot of the new ones now are pink. They have flashy names like Hot Lips and things like that. And so people are drawn to some of these beautiful flower colors. I think people are also drawn to some of the names. This is our native turtlehead. It's got a great white flower. It is certainly a great performer that likes shade to part sun. So if you're looking to kind of brighten up a dark area, turtlehead is certainly one of those plants that can do it. I have enjoyed this plant in my garden for many, many years. It's easily transplantable. I think that if you do gardens like moonlight gardens and things like that, this is one that you should consider having as a great native. It also has kind of a longer flower to it, so a lot of pollinators are attracted to it. Coreopsis, I think everybody knows the name Coreopsis. There's a lot of them out there. Moonbeam Coreopsis, Zebgreb Coreopsis. This is Coreopsis lanceolata. This guy can be a little bit aggressive. And so if you're looking for a spot to put kind of a bully native, I would include this in that category. Great yellow flower. It's blooming right now. It does seed, and those seeds do jump around. So it's not uncommon to see this plant somewhere else in your garden, even though you may have planted only in one spot. I think it's kind of a great spring yellow when we really haven't entered the yellow season. For me, the yellow season, certainly in a native part of the year, is July and August, when a lot of our Sylphians are flowering. That might be our Prairie Dock, our cup plant, our compass plant, those are other tall natives, but we have kind of a yellow season. It's really nice to get some yellows early on in the spring. Coreopsis is a great one. I have noticed throughout the years when they've tried to introduce new Coreopsis, and especially the roses and the reds, they just don't seem to last long. They're quickly off the market. And so this is, again, another tried and true. I think it has a nice flower. I also do a lot of cut flowers from my own house. This is one that is always in the mix and the vase. This is one that a lot of you may not have heard of. Every time people hear of clover, they think of a weed in their lawn. They look to get rid of it. This is just a great pop of color. I think when you talk about perennials, you talk about color, but I also think you talk about kind of the shape of what's going on. This one is very whimsical. When it's windy out, you can kind of see how the flower head kind of develops and leaves kind of this cone-like shape up top. The picture certainly is worth 1,000 words. On the bottom left-hand side, it is a pollinator-friendly plant. And I think, again, it is a great thing that you can add to your garden when you can bring in pollinator plants that we know will help our pollinators. Keep in mind, a lot of us think that honeybees are a native insect here, and honeybees are not. They've actually been brought over from Europe. Myself, a beekeeper, I appreciate the fact that I have them in and around my garden pollinating, but we have 300 to 400 native insects that actually bees that pollinate our plants here in Illinois. And so we want to provide as much food source as we can. Shooting star, again, this is kind of just a native gem that most of us don't think about, because when it's done flowering, it's really a flat plant that would be better served as a border plant in our garden. You know, I'm not going to say it rivals Columbine or Bleeding Heart, but it is certainly a great little flower. It comes in pink and white. I've noticed in my own garden it's a reseeder, and so sometimes I have more pink than I have more white. A dainty little flower, but nonetheless, just the way that it's set up, it's a great early season border perennial that I think you'll enjoy using. We already talked about echinacea, 39 different varieties of echinacea. I'm sure many of you can remember when the Botanic Gardens introduced the the orange echinacea. And, you know, from that point on, it has just been a whirlwind of genetics and developers coming up with different colors and styles of echinacea. We had the Big Sky series, we have double bloomers, we have single bloomers. You know, back in the day, there was one pink and one white echinacea, and now there are so many. And, you know, it's important to note when you do your gardens, when you design your gardens, when you work with our staff to design your gardens, some of these plants just are really trendy and they're not going to be along for a long time. And so if you lose 4 or 5 of them and you need to replace them in several years, there may be already newer varieties that have taken its place. So I highly recommend you keep the tags on your plants. Echinacea and coral bells heuchera, which we'll talk about shortly, is some of those plants where they're kicking them out so fast and taking them off the market that, you know, we're not even sure what's out there anymore. And so when you do have a designer come over to your house or you're talking about these plants, it's very easy, as we said, to use the genus Echinacea, but to figure out what the species is or the cultivar gets more and more difficult as these plants enter the market. Ferns, I just learned this week that there is a fern shortage. So who would have thought that we were kind of struggling to get ferns into the garden center and into our landscape industry. A lot of the fern growers that are up north in northern Michigan and Canada just had a bad go of it, as did a lot of people who were growing tropicals down south. I think ferns don't get enough attention. I think we've kind of gotten away from ferns and we need to kind of start thinking about them. They have a great shape, they have a great texture, and you can see, you know, they just add a lot to the garden. For me personally, I just have not had good success with ferns. I think if you have a garden where you can grow ferns, the success is endless. For someone like me who has tried, you know, I just feel like I haven't sited them in the right area. And so cinnamon fern, another great fern, 5 feet. You know, this one gets 5 feet. You can see it in the bottom there with some, looks like some Solomon seal. This is the fronds or that cinnamon stalk to give it the name cinnamon fern. And then of course, Christmas fern, which I think is just a great texture, great feel to it. I think it really pops in the garden. A lot of the ferns that people are gravitating towards now are things like ghost fern, some of the cultivars of ghost ferns, painted fern. And although a lot of those are very sharp in the garden, they can be a little bit temperamental. And so they don't have the native stamina that some of the ferns that we see naturally occurring have. Joe Pye Weed, this is a big plant. This is one that is a great back of the border plant, great for naturalizing. A lot of the newer introductions are actually purple. They call them chocolate. They're a little bit shorter, which I can appreciate in incorporating into a garden. But this is certainly a plant that when it's blooming, I see a number of butterflies on. 7 feet. Can you imagine that? 7 feet in height for Joe Pye Weed. It is probably a plant that you've heard. It's a common name in the gardening industry, but you don't necessarily see it a lot in people's gardens anymore. And whether that's because it's just too big for the spaces people have to work with, or people have just kind of, again, fallen off the native bandwagon and gone to some of the other newer cultivars, I'm not sure. But if you want a great plant that really can help hide your neighbors, help hide your electric boxes, hide some of those things that you don't want to see during the summer months, I would highly recommend considering Joe Pye Weed as one of those options. Queen of the Prairie, Philippendula, another tall plant, a 7-footer. Doesn't seem to have the mass as Joe Pye Weed, but it has this kind of light and lacy cotton candy, almost smoke-like appearance to it. This is another great native. This is one that I kind of take in smaller numbers. You know, I normally don't go ahead and plant this in any great numbers, even though I find the foliage or the flower somewhat attractive. I just think throughout the year, it's not one that I regularly plant in my garden because after the flower, it doesn't have as much to offer as some of the other perennials. Strawberry, a lot of us, are familiar with strawberry, more the edible strawberries that we put in our garden. This one happens to be wild strawberry. There's also barren strawberry, which has a yellow flower. This is another great ground cover. So in the beginning of the session, we talked about some of the other ground covers that were great natives like ginger and anemone. This is a great one if you want something to creep. It is deciduous like the other plant, so it does lose its leaves. And it does actually get a tiny strawberry. They're edible. They're not sweet like a strawberry you get out of a store, out of your own garden. They're great for feeding wildlife. It certainly doesn't attract a lot of nuisance wildlife. The strawberries are not as abundant as you'd find in your own strawberry plants, but a great little plant for ground cover with cute little white flowers. But more importantly, I'm a firm believer that if you can get plants to cover up a lot of the soil, that just means less weeding. And that is certainly my goal in my gardens, is to reduce my weeding and spend more time enjoying them. Geranium is another plant that has come a long way. There is a lot of geraniums out there. There's Bloody Cranesbill and there's Roseanne, and there's a lot of great colors. Wild geranium is just really part of a native garden and certainly a native woodland. When you walk a lot of the trails in and around Cook and Lake County, this is one that is flowering now. It has a fragrance to it like most geraniums do. And this is one that I think has been overlooked because of the newer cultivars. Nice soft pink flower, tried and true, comes back every year. It's not an aggressive plant by any means. And so if you're looking to kind of tie down a corner, if you're looking for one of those difficult spots where you can't necessarily find the right plant, I'd highly recommend you consider this one. It's a full sun to part shade plant. And I think that it's one that you might really enjoy if you haven't used it already. Alum root. Now this is interesting. So this is a plant that everybody is seeking out. So when I say heuchera or coral bells, people say, oh yeah, coral bells. A lot of people don't know that this also shares the name prairie alum root. And so I'm going to give you an example of what most people see when they come to our store. But this is one that, like Echinacea, has just increased in popularity over the years. It's increased in its cultivars over the years. There used to be the green native prairie allium, and now we have purples and we have chocolates, and we've got some that are a little bit light green and some that are a little darker green and some that have different veinations. And so when you come to the garden center here, you're going to see a bunch of different coral bells. And, a lot of these have been on the market for only a few years. Again, another reason to keep your tags on these, because you can see how many green ones there are. Some are a little bit lighter green than others. Some are a little darker. And so it's really hard to really pick out what it is you bought unless you have the tags. I have to say, I am just drawn to this plant because of all the different styles and textures. But, I'm finding that some of the newest cultivars are not as long-lived as the old ones. And so I think when we go ahead and we promote these plants in the garden center, we have a couple of different shoppers. We have shoppers who come in and they say, I'd like to plant native. And right here, we have a whole native selection. And in the native selection, we have this prairie alum or prairie alum root. In our non-native section, right across the aisle, is our coral bells. And, I believe that if we were to introduce some of our native coral bells into this section, more and more people would pick the native because it's such a dark green leaf. It's got a great flower head on it, long white stalk that certainly rivals all these. But what they're missing is the fact that they've come to the coral bell section and not necessarily the native section. And this really is true for a lot of our plants. So if we can go ahead as a company and start to incorporate some of the natives into these non-native areas to give people the option, I think they'll recognize them more, they'll read the tags, and they may consider buying them. And that's true with Echinacea, that's true with Liatris, that's true with alum root. A lot of these natives cross over and they're in the native section. And so when people want native, they go to the native section, not thinking that they might be found somewhere else. And so prairie alum root, again, I challenge anyone out there to plant this plant when they're looking for a green coral bells and just see the durability and the longevity of this plant. The flower is great. As you deadhead these flowers, I think it's just a really good solid mass of green leaves through the rest of the year. One thing to note just about corbels in general is that a lot of the purple varieties, the more sun they get, the more brown they get. And so I find that if you do have a little bit more shade, they stay true to color. One of the darkest ones that I like is Obsidian. That one seems to be really true to color. But when you get some of the other corbels like Palace Purple, in the full sun, they kind of brown out. So think about what it is you're trying to get out of that plant, if it's flower color, if it's texture or form or flower, and then just site it in the right area. I just earlier mentioned Liatris, great plant for cut flowers. A lot of times you'll get these in flower vases if you give them as gifts. Certainly one to have in the garden. The native gets about 3 feet tall. I actually have one in my garden that seems to get 6 feet tall, 6-foot flower spike. It's hard to believe, but it actually is true. And this really has some nice light and lacy foliage throughout the year. Strong performer, I would say mid to late summer. And just a great purple, long cylindrical flowers. I'm sure many of you have seen this particular plant. Interesting enough, there are not a lot of cultivars of this plant out on the market. And so more and more people, if you want this in your garden, are forced to buy the native. As this plant becomes developed and breeders start to get a hold of it, I'm sure it wouldn't be uncommon for us to see, you know, maybe reds or oranges or yellows, whatever it is that they're trying to develop in the future. And again, clearly different than what the native is intended to be. And that's a long purple flower stalk, which is loved by all sorts of moths and bees and butterflies. Bluebells, you know, this is a great plant. The only drawback to this plant, as many of you know, a lot of these plants exist on the North Shores. They disappear. They're gone. We have these great flowers, and all of a sudden our bluebells disappear. It's been an incredibly hot and dry spring for us, and we know that these bluebells now are just really tuckered out, and they are dropping flat on the ground, at which time you will go ahead and clean them up, and they'll be back next year. A great reseeder. If you like this plant, it's a great seed to collect and sprinkle in other parts of your garden. I just feel like bluebells is the beginning of spring for me. When I see these blooming, it just puts a smile on my face. You know, I wouldn't say that it's something that I notice because of the fragrance as much as I notice because of the appearance. It can really change a dark woodland into something beautiful. Can be incorporated in any perennial garden, especially if you're looking to go ahead and change things out seasonally. You want to put annuals in there. It's a good plant that comes up in the spring, disappears, and allows you to do some other gardening in the meantime. So something to consider, but keep in mind, just like bleeding heart, if it gets a little bit hot, this plant has a tendency to disappear in your garden. So I don't want you to think that it died. It's just kind of senesced for the year. Wild bergamot, most of you guys know this plant is bee balm. It's in the mint family. You can see on the bottom right-hand corner, we've got this little seed head for the wildlife to get in the wintertime. Bee balm, like anything in the mint family, can be a little bit aggressive. This one has a light pink flower. A lot of the new cultivars are red, and just really outstanding as far as Monarda goes. I have to say the pink is equally as nice. You can see in the forefront of the larger picture is actually a milkweed. And so it blends right into the milkweed. True native, you got the mailbox there. So this person is definitely promoting natives in their own yard. And it is a fragrant plant because it's not only in the mint family, but it is also somewhat aggressive. So it can be moved, it can be relocated if you want. If you have an area that's tough to grow things in, Monarda would be one that I would highly recommend. I do like some of the newer cultivars that are not natives, some of the darker reds. I think they make a great pop, but if you're trying to stick native or you would like to introduce some Monarda into your garden, this would be one that you can certainly introduce. Primrose. This is one that, you know, I think I remember 20 or 30 years ago using quite regularly, and it seemed to have kind of dropped off. There's really only 2 primroses out there in the market that people use regularly. Missouri Evening Primrose is one of them. This gets to be about 8 to 12 inches tall and wide, has a nice little green leaf, sometimes comes out red, great little open bell-shaped flower. A lot of people who are gardeners know primrose, and this is one that I think just has been overlooked because there's so many new plants out there on the market that this just doesn't get the attention that it should. And this is one that you might want to consider, at least for a border planting, to add a little bit of native into your garden. It's not a showstopper by any means, but it's still just kind of an old tried and true plant that probably needs to be brought back. Wow, like what is this? Cactus, right? You know, how many of us know that cactus is native to Illinois? If you want to see cactus native to Illinois, go up to Illinois State Beach in Zion and Waukegan. And I can certainly attest to it because here it is in my own yard. This is the 4th year I've been growing cactus. That's pussy toe that's growing in between it. And so if you look closely, you can see all the new growth on this prickly pear cactus. So yes, cactus is actually native. It is a plant that likes to be suited, as you can imagine, in kind of dry, hot areas. This is somewhat of an experiment for me. You can see that I have wood chips at the base of it. I used to have bluestone chip at the base of it, but it was just getting a little messy and where I had it. So I thought I would try this wood chip instead of the stone. I'm a little worried that the wood chips are going to keep in too much moisture and add too much organic material. But we've had an incredibly dry season, as we discussed early on. And so I haven't had to cross that bridge. But yes, this is prickly pear cactus. It does have an amazing flower. It does have an amazing bud to it, and it does have thorns. So interesting enough, when you come out of winter with this plant, it looks like it's almost soggy and that it's not going to make it. And if you sited it in the right area, this is one that will certainly garner conversation in your garden. One that really does well. I know that the Lake County Forest Preserve has tried it in their entrance at the Greenbelt Cultural Center, which is in North Chicago off of Green Bay Road. And they've had some successes with it too. So highly encourage you guys to get out, go for a walk to Illinois State Beach if you really want to see it in its glory in its native area. But this is one that you can add to your garden. And really, if you want it, add it into your pots in the spring and summertime and then plant it in September into your garden so it kind of roots. This is penstemon. Penstemon is flowering now. It's a great white flower, makes a great cut flower. Actually, it'll last in your vase for about a week or two. Has trumpet flowers, so it's certainly an attractant to bees and butterflies. And so this is one that has also been marketed Husker's Red, a lot of different ones that have red leaves on it, certainly attractive from that standpoint. And I've got to tell you, this last weekend, I was working the farmer's market in Lake Forest at Iowa Farm and came across this one. And boy, you want to talk about a difference in plants. This is one of the new penstemons that we offer here at Chalet. And this is what the native penstemon looks like. And so really, it's hard not to be attracted to something like this when you see it. You know, I certainly was attracted. The customers were attracted to it right away. It was one of the plants we sold out of. And, you know, from an aesthetic standpoint, you know, is the white pretty? Sure it is. But is this a showstopper? Absolutely. And I think that, you know, a lot of what we do, we have retail ready plants that, you know, appeal to the consumers, and they're all great plants. But when things are blooming, they're even more attractive. And this by far is one of the more attractive plants I've seen come out of the growers in a long time. And it just happens to be a penstemon. And so I don't recall the name of it. Like I said, it's a brand new plant for me. I just discovered it this past weekend, but I do know that I believe it's for sale at our store. So if this is one that you would like and you're not going truly native, or you just would like to experiment, this is one that is relatively new on the market. Woodland Phlox. A lot of people know phlox, creeping phlox, and maybe the other standard tall phlox. This is one that's very light and lacy that we see in a lot of wooded areas. It's really kind of the colors that people gravitate to, the purples or violets and whites. Great for naturalizing. Like most phlox, it blooms in early spring. It does like part shade to full shade. So again, if you're looking for a shady plant in a difficult site, I certainly encourage you to try phlox. Once it's blooming, there's not much after it. The foliage is kind of low, and so you're going to have to keep that in mind. It does look great as a mass planting. It does add a pop of color in some dark areas, and really doesn't have any insect or disease problems. As a matter of fact, most of the plants that we've discussed today don't have insect and disease problems. They're not aggressive. They're not taking over your garden like a lot of the introductions. And honestly, it's easier to control our natives if they do become a little aggressive than our non-natives. Jacob's Ladder. This is another great part shade to full shade plant, 8 to 12 inches tall, 12 to 18 inches, excuse me, in width. A great flower. There's a number of different ones that have come on the market that have super fragrant flowers. This is, again, another tried and true. You can see it down on the bottom. Just these really nice light blue flowers, taller plant. Like I said, about 12 inches tall, makes a great mid-range border plant. Flowers, you know, a little bit later than we are now in the growing season. But something that, you know, if you like the light and laciness of it and you like this color, this light violet color, it really is a nice plant. Rudbeckia, again, who doesn't have this in their garden? A lot of people have Goldstrum Rudbeckia, Little Susie. There's a lot of cultivars out there. This is Rudbeckia hirta. It looks like a lot of the other Rudbeckias. The flower head's, you know, slightly bigger. It does get about 36 inches tall, whereas a lot of the other Rudbeckias stay a little bit smaller. Interesting enough, in my opinion, on this particular plant, I don't see the leaf spots and the leaf diseases that I do on Goldstrum and some of the other plants. Some of the other plants, they get a little bit brown, almost like a dark purple as the season kind of progresses, and this one seems to stay pretty clean. Great plant to divide. Can be a bully native in the wrong area, but if you're looking for a pop of color and you want Rudbeckia, I think that this one really is superior to the other Rudbeckias. Not that the flower is, you know, the best. It's certainly a great flower, but some of the other Rudbeckias might have a slightly different flower. But if you're looking at it from a distance and not up close, this is one I would encourage you to do. This is an example in my own garden of how that Goldstrum can be super aggressive. This is from 5 plants, and you can see there are hundreds of little plants. I give this away in the springtime to all my friends and family. I just cannot seem to thin out this border. And so I've noticed that Rudbeckia, in especially the Goldstrum varieties and some of the newer varieties, really can take over a garden in a residential area and become the dominant plant. And once it's done blooming, if there's nothing to follow it, it's kind of a dead spot. And so you do get the added benefit of having the flower heads in the wintertime. But to me, this is a little bit too aggressive to fill in a spot. And so keep that in mind when you're looking at some of these other cultivars. Maybe not so much Little Susie, but some of the Goldstrums, they can be bullies. And so you want to kind of limit that type of plant in your own garden. Asters, that's kind of the tail end of fall, right? When we see the asters blooming. This happens to be New England aster, probably one of the better known asters out there. Who can argue that this is just a great daisy-like flower, great color, great in vases. It is just kind of telling us that summer's coming to an end and fall is fastly approaching. And so this is one that sits pretty idle until, you know, October, November, depending on the weather. And so this is great when a lot of things have done blooming. Even your rebloomers start to slow up towards the end of the year before you get this pop of color in your asters. So if you want a garden that goes from basically spring to fall, make sure you include asters. Certainly New England aster is a great one. You know, it is one that does get a little bit bigger as far as height goes, 48 inches and about 18 inches wide. It does recede. It's not an aggressive receder, but certainly one that I think is just really pretty. And I feel like it's got a nice little scent to it as well. Meadow Rue, Selectrum. This is, again, a kind of a big one. It's basically a backyard light and lacy plant. So this would go to the back of the border. This is kind of a little brittle plant. So if you've got big dogs like I do, this is not the plant that you want in your garden. Selectrum, there's about a couple different varieties that are on the market. None seem to be as durable as the native. Once you get established, it's a great tall plant. It's light and lacy. You can kind of see through it. You can also see the flower head sits up high on this plant. But if there's a strong wind or you have a lot of activity, it's very easy to break this plant. So keep that in mind as you're selecting this one. But a great native, not really known to most people. Maybe Purple Meadow Rue, the common name, is more known than Selectrum. But a lot of times it's not one that's high on people's list. Foamflower, Tiarella. This is actually a great alternative to the coral bells or the heuchera that we saw. You can see it has a maple-like leaf, has a similar flower. It doesn't sit as tall as the coral bells, but this one really has a similar habit. Kind of a sleeper. A lot of people don't recognize this plant. Foamflower is a common name. Tiarella is a scientific name. Again, 8 to 12 inches in height, 18 inches wide. Great alternative if you're looking for a green plant to fill a void in a shady area and you're not having good luck with coral bells, but you like the look. This native plant certainly will do you well. And I've got this one as well in my garden. And, you know, it does spread through rhizomes, I believe, but it's not a bully native by any means. Last on our perennial list of plants or flowers is our Culvers Root. A lot of people have heard Culvers Root. Probably not a lot of people have seen Culvers Root or actually know that the plants they've seen are Culvers Root. See a lot of this in native areas, in open spaces. Again, this is a great plant for backdrop. It also is a tall plant, 4 to 6 feet. It is pretty durable, so it can kind of withstand the winds and the weather and the dogs sometimes. Great plant for naturalizing. Kind of has that salvia look to it or that veronica look in the flower. So it is a great late season plant, full sun to part sun, and a great backdrop. You can also see on the bottom right hand corner, it's certainly great for wildlife. And so as we looked at a lot of these perennials, I encourage you to leave a lot of them for winter interest and certainly for the wildlife in the winter as well. So we're just going to kind of end here with a couple of the grasses. Big bluestem. You know, there's been a lot of push over the last 10 or 15 years for grasses. Many of you may have bought grasses and then realized the grasses you bought are extremely aggressive. They've taken over planting sites. They've gone ahead and hopped and ended up in other beds. They're hard to get rid of once you do get them. A lot of the variegated grasses, especially if they have like a yellow stripe in it or something like that, the zebra grasses, as people tend to call them, are a little bit on the aggressive side. Big bluestem and little bluestem are two great natives that really offer a great fall color. They offer a great seed head. I think they're overlooked because people are looking for things like Carl Forrester or some of the taller grasses that they find that are more, I call residential garden grasses than some of these natives. But if you're looking to create or fill a void or create a hedge or to screen an area, certainly don't rule out big bluestem. You're not going to find, in my opinion, a grass that gets a better fall color, especially when the sun is setting. And you can kind of see the seed heads in the bottom left-hand corner. And a lot of these grasses are really easy to move in your own garden just by pulling your hand across the seed head and then just dropping them on the ground where you want to have them sown. This is an example of grasses coming up in early spring. They look like any other grass. You wouldn't suspect this is a native because it's tied into a garden, but this is a native planting outside of the annuals that you see in kind of that circle there. And so you can have these natives in somewhat of a formal yet loose setting to offer a buffer. Sedge grass, carex, there are so many carex. So the one I'm showing you here is just a species. And what I mean by that is that there are 40, 50, 60, 100 plus carex species out there. Pen sedge is a really popular one, or oak sedge sometimes called. They are great for filling large areas. They're great for naturalizing. They are certainly durable and can handle our climates, handle our temperatures, handle our rains and extremes. A lot of the other grasses, even some of the fancier grasses, seem to drop out. But things like carex, they are great for wet areas, great for naturalizing, and certainly should be one that you should not overlook. A lot of them actually have great textures to them. They have some yellow veination in them. Some of them, like Carex grayi or the burr sedge, have great flower heads to them as well. And so if you've got a wet area and a shady area, certainly consider Carex. Switchgrass, this is one that they've come up with a number of different cultivars. Heavy metal, I think, is one of them. You can see how stately this is in the wintertime. Like any of our grasses and our perennials, They look amazing until we get a really heavy wet snow, and that seems to kind of flatten them all. But nonetheless, you can see the seed heads that are on there. They stand erect throughout the whole summer, again, depending on the snow load, or the winter, I'm sorry, depending on the snow load. So this past winter, you would have had this grass in your garden all the way through February until those big snows came and stuck around through March. And so it's a great buffer plant, and I would encourage you to consider native when you're looking for grasses. The other thing about a lot of these grasses that I've shown you and will finish showing you is they're not aggressive. They're easy to control in your garden. They're easy to divide, and they won't take over like some of those other non-native species. Prarie Dropseed, Sporabilis. I like saying the word Sporabilis, but this is just a great plant. You can see it kind of arching and mounding. When you are going ahead and maintaining your grasses in the springtime, it's important that if you do cut them back, you don't cut them back so hard where they have to work so hard to kind of come back to life. A lot of people cut them too close to the ground when really you should be cutting them kind of a little higher than 6 inches off the ground. Kind of a mounding plant. I mentioned to you that, anywhere where there's soil, weeds are very opportunistic. They're going to hop in. This is a great plant for mass planting where you can kind of keep the soil from showing up in weed setting. I've used this in a number of designs, and I think it just has this real great, almost more look to it. And so that is the end of our introducing native perennials into our landscape. I want to, encourage you guys to come to the store to look in the native section to compare a lot of the natives that we have to the non-natives. I think many of you will find that outside of some fancy colors or maybe some different shapes, that they're very similar and they offer a lot more to our native pollinators and certainly to our wildlife. If you have any questions, I really encourage you to go online and reach out to our staff, and they can go ahead and hook you up with a chalet representative who can come out to your yard after you answer a number of questions so that we can fit you with the right person here and try to get you some either native plants, trees, or shrubs. Because as we see the weather patterns changing, we're realizing that a lot of our natives are looking great and a lot of our non-natives aren't. And so we've got a couple questions in the queue, and so I'm going to see what I can answer and be conscious of everybody's time. So if you give me 1 second. Copies of the programs.
They go on YouTube after. They go on YouTube after.
Okay. All right, so we've got a couple comments. One that I've seen a couple times is about the presentation, and you guys are more than welcome to go online. It will be a YouTube presentation once we get everything taken care of, and so if you want to see it again or you want to look at some of the plants in more detail, feel free to go online once we get that posted. I think it takes about a week or so.
It'll be on YouTube tomorrow.
Oh. Apologize. It'll be on YouTube tomorrow. So you can go there tomorrow and we will have it. What else? Let's see. Someone heard that Meadow Rue is toxic and help keep bugs away from roses. I don't know if I have heard that. And so I can't answer that question. Speaking of, what keeps bugs away from roses, I was at a client's house about 2 weeks ago, and she mentioned that the allium plants, she plants up and around her roses, and it has kept all of the bugs away. And so some of these are wives' tales. Some of these are, really tried and true gardening secrets. I have not been able to figure out if that is a tried and true gardening secret or not. She happened to be using the Millennium, the one I said I had in my garden that's kind of escaping a little. And so if there's anybody out there who has tried Millennium, allium, and, has also been able to keep some of the bugs away from the roses, I'd be curious to find out if that's true or not. So that is something that I thought was pretty interesting. Let's see here if we got any other questions. Sorry. Give me 1 second here. We have one question that says, what is a native fall grass for shade? And I think I mentioned a lot of the Carex do really well in shade. And so I'm not sure if fall, you're looking for fall color. A lot of the Carex kind of have a yellow color to them in fall. Nothing as showy as some of the blue stems. And so that is something that you might want to consider are those Carex. They also do well, some of them in wet areas. Let me see. We have Mike's asking, he has some native Columbine, which get a whitish, I'm guessing fungus on their leaves. And he's wondering if it's a disease. You know, the Columbine do tend to get a little powdery mildew. That is something that, you know, is usually an air circulation problem. So if you're not getting a lot of air circulating, which sometimes in some of these areas we don't, that's something that you want to keep an eye on. I've never really seen it wipe out the Columbine. I think if anything, it's more aesthetically unpleasing than anything else, but I have not seen it personally kill Columbine. So if it bothers you, you can go ahead, as silly as it sounds, clean the leaves, use a safer soap and spray on that, but not anything I would really overly worry about. Another question about, does Chalet have a handout in regards to these natives? You know, I can't think of one off the top of my head. Obviously, you know, there's a lot of information online, and I encourage you guys to go online. But as I encourage you to go online, I ask you to consider a number of things. One is the source. We have some great resources here with Chalet, the Chicago Botanic Gardens, the Morton Arboretum. Those are great sources for you to use. Keep in mind, what's native here in the Chicagoland region may not be native in central and southern Illinois. And so make sure you know what zone you're in and where you're getting your information before you make a decision to go ahead and purchase something. And so the forest preserves, actually Cook and Lake County, also have a lot of good native information about native plants. But I find the Botanic Gardens, the Chalet website, we offer a lot of good information about particular plants. Question came in, is it too dry now to plant or wait till fall? Well, it is incredibly dry out there. We're 8 inches below normal. Some of the farmers in McHenry County are a little bit worried that they're going to be losing their corn crops because of the drought that we're in. You know, it showed rain in the forecast at the beginning of the week, and many of us has not received rain. So the good thing about being a residential homeowner is that you can supplement the rain. So if you have an irrigation system, I highly encourage you to turn it on and turn it up during this really hot and dry time. If you can hand water, that's preferable in my opinion. As much as I want you to go ahead and turn on your irrigation system, we do see a lot of plants dying from overwatering. So that probably won't be the case with many of your perennials. I am of the mindset that if you are going to do planting, fall is a great time to plant, but make sure you get your perennials in before September 15th. You want to make sure that they have time to root. The soil is a lot warmer, and you don't want them to heave over the winter time, and that's when you end up losing them because they freeze and they end up dying. So if you can get a majority of your perennials and especially your ground cover in by September 15th, you will be good to go. And let's see, does wild bergamot reseed heavily? I've cut the dead blooms off, but would love to leave them for the winter birds. You know, the thing with natives is that they do reseed, but they're very easy, I think, as long as you don't allow them to get established, to pull out. And so I would go ahead and leave those. I think they are great for winter interests. They're great for birds, and I would not be worried that it's going to take over my garden. Unlike some of the mints that people are planting from their garden, there's a lot of different mints that are out there for garden use. There's chocolate mint, mojito mint, all these different things. When those mints seem to escape and get in your garden, they are very aggressive, but the native Monarda is not one of those. And then the last question we have, so we can let you guys go, is how do you speak to clients who are apprehensive towards native plants? And, you know, that couldn't be a better way to close this presentation. You know, as I showed you, and jokingly aside, that picture of the buffalo, when people think about native plants, they think about big prairies, they think about open spaces. They don't think that that's something that they can do in their own yard. And, you know, hopefully today I've encouraged you guys to consider planting natives in your yard, using really the same plants that you might have used that were non-native. So or cultivars or nativars. And so, you know, if you are looking for a perennial garden and you are looking for yellow and you have Rudbeckia on your list, you know, choose the native version. If you want to go ahead and plant coneflower, because a lot of people know what coneflower is, pick the native version. It's just a tried and true plant that we know is going to be around for a long time. We know that we're going to be able to replace that plant in the event that it doesn't make it. Whereas a lot of these cultivars really have not seen the extreme weather patterns that we've had. I mean, many of you, as I mentioned earlier, can remember the 3 consecutive record-breaking rains we've had, as well as that polar vortex that was just, you know, about 3 years ago. And so if you look at the last 3 years and those weather patterns, they've been pretty extreme. And a lot of our natives, and if you look at our open spaces, they're thriving. And so I would say to anybody who is apprehensive about planting native plants that, you know, a lot of the cultivars that you're planting originated from a native plant, and these native plants are tried and true and really are going to beautify anybody's garden. And they're going to contribute to the pollination of our native insects and birds and butterflies. So with that, I think we're going to kind of close for the sake of time, but I really appreciate everybody who was on the call today. Sorry about the technical glitch we had early on. Hopefully we didn't lose anybody. And I'm looking forward to seeing you guys in the garden. Bye.